Climate change is set to ravage tea production in Kenya, the biggest global supplier of black tea. This is according to a new report by aid organisation Christian Aid, which looks at how shifting temperatures and rainfall patterns in tea-growing regions in Kenya, India, Sri Lanka and China could affect the quality and yield of the world's most popular beverage and also threaten the livelihoods of millions of plantation workers. Tea is one of Kenya's top foreign currency earners, along with tourism and remittances, employing about 3 million people. But the East African country, which produces almost half the tea consumed in Britain, is likely to see the areas with optimal and medium tea growing conditions shrink by about 25 to 40% respectively by 2050. Kenya is highly vulnerable to climate change, with projections suggesting that its average annual temperature will rise by up to 2.5 degrees Celsius between 2000 and 2050. The report warns that the livelihoods of more than 3 million people in Kenya's tea industry would come under threat in the next 2 decades. Africa makes up 17% of the world's population, but generates just 4% of the greenhouse gas emissions that have caused the current climate crisis. Well, to tell us a little bit more about this report, we're now joined via Zoom from the UK by Dr Katherine Kramer, who's the global lead for climate change at Christian Aid. Thanks so much indeed for joining us. Welcome to the programme.
Thank you.
So this report doesn't paint a great picture at all for our continent, sadly. And what's even sadder is perhaps that we feel the effects much more and yet contribute much less to these rising temperatures.
That's very true, and that's one of the big corner issues around climate justice, and one of the reasons that Christian Aid has become involved in climate change. We were one of the first aid agencies to see that climate change was a risk to all the development work that we've done over many, many decades, and also the threat to the people of the global south, who do suffer the consequences of climate change much more, but certainly currently, than we do in northern countries.
So has it started to take effect, this drop in yields and quality of tea? Because we're talking about this timeline to 2050, and it sounds like a long time to come, but it's actually not that far ahead. Has it started to play out already?
Well, from the data that we were able to discover, we had figures for India where 88% of plantation managers and 97% of smallholders are already seeing climate change impacts. And certainly anecdotally, we were getting similar reports from some of the colleagues we have in Kenya.
So what can be done to try and stop it, if not reverse it, if we're not the ones actually contributing to the gas house emissions?
Well, from an African perspective, I think there's 3 main areas to focus on. One is calling out the developed countries for their lack of climate ambition. And I think this year's UN climate talks will be an important part of that conversation. Each country is supposed to come forward with a new emissions reductions pledge. And countries like those in Africa can play a role as some of the conscience of the world to try and increase that ambition so that we can limit temperatures to the level that we need. Second, I think there's also the need to really call out the developed countries for the need for enhanced climate finance to support resilience building and adaptation to these climate effects. Our report does show that in Kenya, it will be hard to move some of those tea plantations to other areas as the climate changes. And certainly there is a lead time for growing a new plant. But I think the third thing that African countries can offer to the climate debate is to leapfrog. And certainly feedback that we get when we talk to groups like the World Bank is that there isn't necessarily the demand for clean energy coming from some of the African governments. There's still a demand for fossil fuels. And that call for leapfrogging, I think, is a very important contribution that African countries can make to the climate debate, as well as playing the role as a conscience role.
What are the tea farmers telling you in Kenya at the moment?
So anecdotally, we are seeing changes. They are noticing differences in the temperature, in the rainfall, and they are noticing that there are declines in the tea yield.
All right. And in the introduction, we talked about the taste of the tea changing. Is that directly related to climate change, or what could be happening?
So the taste of the tea depends on the biochemistry of the plant, and that's affected by the ecological cues that it gets from its environment and the climatic conditions around it. And so if it's wet and the tea plants are waterlogged, the plants don't get the cues that they need to produce some of these fine aromatic compounds that give the tea its flavour. And then there's a double whammy, because if the plant's taking up more water, it dilutes those chemicals that it does have. And so you will get a much less flavoursome tea coming out of it.
All right, you talked a short while ago about finding new areas. So uncultivated land, is that already damaged even before you've started planting because of this climate drama?
I think it would be a matter of looking quite carefully across the tea growing areas and potential new tea growing areas, looking at how the climate is predicted to change. I haven't seen any figures on what that actually looks like.
All right, and this, of course, has an impact on real people's lives, jobs, and the economy.
Yes, that's right. We're already hearing that it's becoming harder to recruit young people into the tea industry because they see that it does have a potentially troubled future. But that is a future that we can do something about if we do use these opportunities to reduce our emissions in the next few years, particularly in the global north and the high-consuming countries.
So I know you're in England and everybody loves their cup of tea. What are they going to do? Population is growing, and 4 o'clock tea time, what's going to happen?
I honestly don't know, but we've had a lot of headlines for this report.
Yeah.
It's obviously causing a certain amount of consternation over here.
All right, so you've talked about this upcoming UN climate talks taking place in November. Is Africa on the agenda, or do they talk about climate change generally? Because I feel almost as if we need to have our own story told there, because as we discussed at the beginning, we are the biggest victims and yet we're the least contributors.
Well, that's very true. And I think it's really important for Africa to leverage the fact that it will be holding the next UN climate talks, so in 2022, and working with the UK to really put forward an agenda that isn't just 1 year by 1 year, but that actually uses this meeting to feed towards the African COP next year. And certainly we're advocating very strongly for some of the priorities that are needed, such as loss and damage, which the developed countries in general are quite resistant to talking about. That's beyond where the impacts of climate change are beyond what you can adapt to. It's where there are actual losses that need to be compensated to come into play. And that's an area too where an African voice very strongly calling for this to be addressed properly on the agenda would be very helpful.
What can we do in Africa ourselves? Yes, we are not huge contributors to the global problem, but there must be things that we can do to contribute to the decreasing of this temperature.
Well, I guess there's going to be different ways that people can do that. They can look at their own consumption patterns, and that's going to be different for different people in different countries. If there are opportunities to switch to renewable energy suppliers or to put renewable energy in their homes, to think about things like how they can lobby their politicians, because what we really need is not just individual changes, as useful as they can be, but really to get much more systematic changes. So lobbying governments, lobbying big polluting companies. You can see really quite significant changes if the public does get behind a particular company, puts pressure on it to make changes, and quite often they will make those changes. And then internationally, making sure that that African voice is being heard, again, through lobbying politicians, making sure that there is that call from the ground up, from the grassroots, for real climate action, for real clean development.
As global lead climate change at Christian Aid, this is a battle that you have every single day with these governments. What are they resisting? What are they finding difficult to do? Because what's required is huge steps, not the incremental steps that we're seeing.
That's very true. I think there's a number of factors. First of all, I think the kind of scale of the change is pretty daunting, and it's something that needs to be looked at in quite a holistic manner. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change came out with a report about 2.5 years ago, looking at how we get to 1.5 degrees and how important that it is that we don't exceed that temperature limit. But they looked at the co-benefits of climate action as well as other forms of sustainable development. And in the vast majority of cases, you would get a double whammy, a double positive hit, by doing good climate action, but also having other good benefits on sustainable development. So it's quite difficult taking on all these vested interests. So for instance, in my own country, although parts of the steel industry globally are looking at using renewable hydrogen instead of carbon to produce their steel, my government's talking about opening up a coal mine to be able to provide coal to allow the steel industry in the UK to carry on as business as usual. So I don't think governments have really grasped the scale of the transformative change, and we are still very much battling vested interests. Although I must say we are seeing some pretty big shifts now in the corporates and some of the financial actors as well.
All right, so the main focus of this conversation really has been about tea production in Kenya, but it's not just Kenya though, is it? And it's tea producers around the world that are getting caught up with this.
Yes, I mean, climate change, I think this is another problem why governments are also not acting. It's a global problem. And so if you have years of a country big with lots of emissions like the USA not doing its fair share, not acting on climate, then it becomes a much harder argument to move forward for other countries to take action. It needs to be a global concerted effort.
All right, Dr. Katherine Kramer. I don't know what Boris Johnson's going to do without his cup of tea, but let's hope they do something and drop these temperatures. Thanks so much indeed for joining us.
Thank you very much.
All right, that's Dr. Catherine Cramer, who's Global Lead Climate Change at Christian Aid, talking to us a very serious issue. Kenya looks like it's going to see dramatic shifts over the next 20 to 30 years in its tea production. Could be as bad as 40%, and that of course is going to just affect jobs, the economy, employment, livelihoods will be affected, all because of the climate change story, temperatures rising, and it could be as much as 2.5 degrees by 2050 unless something is done, and done urgently.